5 True Train and Subway Horror Stories. When I was about 8 years old, I had an experience that still gives me chills to this day. My older sister, who was 15 at the time, and I were traveling to visit our grandparents for the weekend. It was just the two of us, and we were excited to take the train. Trains fascinated us, and our parents had agreed to let us go on this adventure together. The journey was supposed to be simple, a few hours from our city to theirs. We woke up early that morning, our bags packed with our favorite snacks and books to keep us entertained. The station in our city was bustling with people, the sound of announcements echoing through the terminal as we shuffled along with the crowd. I remember the smell of hot dogs from a nearby stand, mixed with the scent of fresh rain that had just started to fall. Our excitement was palpable, the energy of the station infecting us as we hurried to board the train. As we found our seats by the window, the warmth of the train and the quiet hum of the engine felt comforting. I leaned against the glass, watching the world blur by as we pulled away from the station. My sister and I passed the time by pointing out the passing landmarks and making up stories about the people we saw on the train. The ride was smooth, and we barely noticed the time slipping by as we lost ourselves in the rhythm of the train's journey. The train was almost completely full, and I remember feeling the weight of all the passengers' eyes as they glanced around. But as we arrived in our grandparents' city, most of the other passengers disembarked with us, leaving the station quieter and calmer than before. Inside the station, we realized our grandparents hadn't arrived yet to pick us up. My sister, being the older one, took the initiative and decided to use the restroom. She told me to stay put, so I sat down on one of the benches, scanning the crowd of commuters who passed by. The station was more empty now, and the stillness was almost eerie compared to the bustle we had just experienced. The light flickered above me as I waited, my fingers fidgeting with the strap of my backpack. After a couple of minutes, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She was older, with dark, shoulder-length hair and a heavy coat that seemed too warm for the season. She had a strange look in her eyes, a kind of urgency that I couldn't place. Without a greeting, she pointed toward the train we had just left and said, "Your sister got back on the train. She's looking for you." I was young and naive, so I believed her without question. I thought maybe we had gotten off at the wrong stop, or maybe my sister had realized she had forgotten something on the train. The idea of her being lost or confused set a nervous flutter in my chest, and I immediately followed the woman back to the platform. The woman didn't walk beside me, but led me by a few steps, her pace quick and almost hurried. We boarded the train again, and she walked to the row next to mine, sitting down without saying a word. I glanced around, expecting to see my sister, but there was no sign of her. I felt a growing unease in my stomach. My mind raced, wondering where she could be, why she wasn't there waiting for me. I decided to search the train. I wandered up and down the aisles, my small footsteps echoing in the silence, but I found no trace of my sister. The train was eerily quiet now, no longer filled with the chatter and noise of fellow passengers. Then, as I peered out the window, I saw her standing just outside the station, looking frantically in my direction. Her face was a mixture of confusion and worry. Relief flooded through me, and I rushed to get off the train. As I stood to leave, the woman stood up too, blocking my way. She asked, "Where are you going?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm for the situation. I barely registered her words as I pushed past her and ran off the train. I didn't stop to hear her response, my only focus on reaching my sister. When I finally reached her, she was visibly upset and asked what I was doing. I explained everything: the woman, the train, how I thought she had gotten back on. My sister's face turned pale. She grabbed my arm tightly, her voice firm as she said, "We're in the right city. I don't know why that woman told you that." It was then that I realized something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible that day. The train had departed moments later, and we never saw that woman again. But to this day, I can't help but wonder what her true intentions were, and why she had made me believe that my sister was lost. The man in the subway years later. As an adult living in a big city, I often took the subway to and from work. Over time, I'd grown accustomed to the variety of people you'd encounter, some interesting, others a bit sketchy. But one evening, I had an encounter that I'll never forget. It was late, and the train wasn't crowded. I was scrolling through my phone, the hum of the train's movement soothing me into a daze. That was until I noticed him. A man was sitting a few seats away, dressed entirely in black, a sweatshirt, gloves, and most unsettling of all, a ski mask paired with sunglasses. The mask covered his entire face, and I couldn't discern anything about him except that he was tall, with a broad build that made him seem even more imposing. I tried to ignore him, chalking it up to city life, where strange things often became normal. I buried myself in my phone, but my unease grew as I felt his presence linger in the corner of my eye. It was as though he was watching me, even though I couldn't see his eyes behind the mask and sunglasses. As the train slowed and my stop approached, I almost missed it, distracted by my phone. Realizing just in time, I quickly stood and made my way toward the doors. But then, I noticed something chilling. The masked man stood up too, following right behind me. The doors opened, and I stepped off the train, my heart pounding. I walked through the station toward the stairs, trying to keep a normal pace despite the growing panic. I glanced back, and there he was about 40 feet behind me, moving with the same measured steps. My stomach twisted, and a primal sense of fear rose within me. I picked up my pace, turning down a familiar route, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But, to my horror, I saw him following me again, mirroring my every move. My mind raced, and I knew I had to act fast. I spotted a deli I'd visited before and decided to take refuge inside. I quickly made my way to the back of the shop, where I knew there was a hidden exit. As I rounded the corner, I risked a glance back and saw him entering the store, his movements slow and deliberate. A wave of panic swept over me. I hurried through the back door and into the alley, not daring to look behind. I ran down the narrow path, my heart hammering in my chest, until I reached the nearest street. Only then did I slow down, allowing myself to catch my breath. I never saw him again. Whether it was just my imagination, or whether he had some dark intention, I'll never know. But I'm thankful I didn't stick around to find out. The train tracks and the stranger, another unsettling memory, comes from when I was around 12 or 13. My family lived in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by fields and woods. During summer, a group of local kids and I would often gather to play in a large open field near some old train tracks. The tracks were rarely used, and trains passing through were a rare sight. One evening, as we played kickball, the sun set and darkness crept in. The group dwindled to just 4 of us. We were laughing, the distant hum of the train that passed earlier still in our ears. Suddenly, the ground trembled as a train approached. We stopped our game and stood at the edge of the field, peering through the trees as the train slowly passed by. The light from our flashlights illuminated the moving train, casting eerie shadows as we watched. It was a long, slow-moving freight train, and as it rounded the bend toward the woods, something strange caught our attention. One of the last train cars had an open door, and inside stood a man. He wasn't just standing there, though he was staring directly at us, his eyes fixed on us with an intensity that felt unnatural. The train continued its slow movement, but the man's gaze never wavered. Even from a distance, I felt a chill run through me. The train finally came to a complete stop at the edge of the woods, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the man stepped off the train. We froze, unsure of what to do. The man stood still for a second, his eyes still locked on us, before he began walking toward the woods. We didn't move, rooted to the spot by fear and confusion. He didn't say a word, just walked slowly into the darkness. The shadows seemed to swallow him whole as he disappeared into the trees. None of us dared to move for several moments. When the silence became unbearable, we turned and ran back to our homes, not stopping until we were safely inside. To this day, I wonder who he was, what he wanted, and why he was there that night. I've often thought about how easily things could have gone differently. Sometimes, the most unsettling encounters are the ones that never get explained. These memories still haunt me. They're a reminder that sometimes we come face to face with something that can't be easily explained, something that remains in the dark corners of our minds, lingering long after the moment has passed. A series of strange encounters. Chapter 1. The Man in the Woods. It started as a simple game of kickball on a warm summer evening. The kind where the air smells like freshly cut grass, and the golden sunset bathes everything in a warm glow. My friends and I had gathered at the local park, our laughter and shouts echoing across the field. The day had been perfect until it wasn't. As the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, someone suggested we each take one last kick before heading home. My turn came first, and I wanted to make it count. With a determined swing, my foot connected with the ball, sending it soaring high and far, toward the edge of the woods that bordered the field. Cheers erupted behind me as I jogged to retrieve it. The ball had landed close to the tree line, just far enough that the dense shadows of the woods swallowed it up. I paused for a moment, staring into the dimly lit expanse of trees. The woods had always unsettled me. Something about the way the tall, gnarled trees seemed to whisper secrets made my skin crawl. But I wasn't about to admit that to my friends. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the shadows. The ball wasn't hard to find. It sat a few feet away, nestled in a patch of fallen leaves. As I bent to pick it up, a noise stopped me cold. It was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone, or something, was moving in the woods. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A dark figure emerged from behind a tree, stepping closer to the edge of the woods. The figure was tall, with long, unkempt hair and a beard that made his face hard to discern in the fading light. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the ball and ran as fast as I could back to my friends. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of the group. "Someone's in the woods," I blurted out, struggling to catch my breath. My friends turned to look, but the man was gone. They laughed it off, teasing me for being scared of shadows. But I knew what I saw. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the woods was still watching me. Chapter 2. The Mystery of the Wallet. A few years later, I found myself in New York City for the second time. The city was a whirlwind of noise, lights, and people, and I loved every second of it. Traveling alone gave me a sense of freedom, but it also meant I had to be extra careful. I clutched my bag tightly as I navigated the crowded streets and subway stations. One evening, after a long day of exploring, I boarded a subway heading back to my hotel. The car was packed, and I managed to squeeze into a seat near the door. A man sat down beside me. He was in his mid-40s, stocky, with light brown hair and a friendly demeanor. We struck up a conversation, chatting about the city and places to visit. He seemed harmless, even kind. As the train rattled along, I felt the fatigue of the day catching up to me. When my stop came, I said goodbye to the man and stepped off the train. It wasn't until I reached the sidewalk that I realized something was wrong. My wallet was gone. Panic set in as I frantically searched my pockets and bag. It was nowhere to be found. My mind raced back to the man on the subway. Had he taken it? Or had I left it behind? Either way, I was stranded in the middle of New York with no cash, no ID, and no credit cards. I hurried back to my hotel, my stomach in knots. The first thing I did was call my bank to freeze all my cards. Thankfully, none had been used yet. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. The cash was gone, but at least my accounts were safe. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Who had my wallet, and what were they planning to do with it? About an hour later, there was a knock at my door. Startled, I peered through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, I found my wallet lying on the floor. Everything was inside, except for the cash. My heart raced as I looked up and down the hallway. It was empty. How had someone found my hotel, let alone my room number? I hurried to the front desk to ask if anyone had turned it in, but the staff had no idea what I was talking about. The mystery deepened when I checked my account activity later that night. Someone had attempted to use my credit card at an ATM just minutes before my wallet appeared at my door. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. The thought that someone had been close enough to return my wallet, yet remain unseen, still sends shivers down my spine. Chapter 3. The photographer on the subway. It was another late night, and I was riding the subway home. The car was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow over the scratched seats and grimy floors. I sat near the middle, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. A man sitting across from me caught my attention. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and a camera slung around his neck. At first, I didn't think much of it. Tourists often took pictures on the subway. But as the train sped through the tunnels, I realized he wasn't photographing the scenery. He was pointing the camera at me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was adjusting the lens or checking the settings. But every time I glanced up, the lens was aimed squarely in my direction. My skin prickled with unease. I kept my eyes glued to my phone, hoping he'd lose interest. He didn't. When my stop arrived, I hurried off the train, my heart pounding. To my dismay, the man followed. He stayed a few steps behind me as I walked down the platform and onto the street. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my ears, quickening with each passing second. I turned a corner and finally worked up the courage to confront him. Spinning around, I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, he bolted. The man took off running, disappearing into the darkness. Relieved but shaken, I continued home, locking the door behind me. An hour later, as I sat in my living room, I happened to glance out the window. My blood turned to ice. There he was, standing on the sidewalk, staring up at my apartment. His camera was raised, the lens pointed directly at me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I closed the blinds, shutting out the sight of him. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, frozen, listening for any signs of movement outside. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek through the blinds again. He was gone. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night haunts me. How had he found my apartment? Was it just a coincidence, or had he followed me all the way home? The questions linger, unanswered, leaving me with an unsettling feeling that I'll never fully shake. Each of these encounters left a mark on me. They're reminders that sometimes the scariest moments in life don't come from ghost stories or urban legends. They come from the people we cross paths with and the mysteries they leave behind.